The car's headlights pierced the oppressive blackness of the mountain road, slicing through the endless forest ahead like a knife cutting through thick fog. The tires hummed against the gravel, the only sound other than the occasional screech of branches against the sides of the car. It had been 2 hours since he'd left the last sign of civilization behind, and yet the phone's GPS insisted there was still another 20 miles to go. Beneath the steady hum of the engine, a faint sense of unease began to creep into Ethan's mind, the kind of unease that he hadn't felt in years. The unsettling sensation that you've just crossed into a place where the rules don't quite apply, where something is waiting and you don't know exactly what. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, staring straight ahead, as though willing himself to power through the eerie feeling. There was no turning back now. Before I dive deeper into the creepy story, if you're enjoying the tension and mystery already, hit that subscribe button and make sure to click the bell so you don't miss out on the next part of the story. Trust me, you'll want to know how this one ends. Ethan had always prided himself on being a rational person, the kind who didn't believe in ghosts, didn't buy into superstition, and definitely didn't flinch at the thought of staying alone in a mountain cabin for a night. He was a freelance journalist, a no-nonsense, all-business kind of guy, focused on the bottom line. He made his living telling stories, but he'd always kept them grounded in fact. He hated mystery for the sake of mystery, and saw the world in simple, rational terms. If something wasn't tangible, it didn't exist. At least, that's what he'd always believed. But as the darkened trees flashed by in the headlights, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something about this cabin, this assignment, was different. His phone had pinged several times in the last hour, with strange texts and cryptic messages from Elias Draymore, the billionaire who'd hired him. Elias was known as an eccentric recluse, more myth than man, and now Ethan had to meet him, write his memoir, and hopefully make enough money to pay off his dwindling debts. It was an offer he couldn't afford to turn down, even if it meant driving deep into a part of the world that most people couldn't find with a map. And yet, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, what was Elias hiding? The cabin came into view abruptly, its silhouette rising from the darkness, like a tombstone rising from the earth. A lone, creaking sign swayed in the wind, the word Drymore barely visible against the night sky. The building was an anomaly, something that shouldn't have been there, perched on the edge of the wilderness as though it had sprung from the earth like a cancerous growth. Ethan parked the car and killed the engine. The stillness of the night seemed to press in from all sides. No animals, no wind, no distant rustling of the leaves, just silence. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at the cabin as the hairs on the back of his neck stood at attention. His hand hovered over the door handle. Just get out, he told himself. It's just a cabin. It's just an assignment. But the knot in his stomach tightened. Ethan had seen a lot of strange things in his career, and yet nothing like this. The eerie silence, the way the cabin seemed to loom larger with each passing second, it was a feeling he couldn't shake. Finally, he stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind him with more force than necessary. His boots crunched on the gravel as he made his way up the steps to the front door. There was no doorbell, no knocker, just a heavy brass handle, cold to the touch. He twisted it. The door opened with an unsettling creak. The interior of the cabin was far grander than Ethan had anticipated. He'd expected something rustic, something off the grid, but instead, he found an opulent space that felt both ancient and modern at the same time. Massive stone fireplaces anchored each wall, and the scent of aged wood and leather lingered in the air. Dimly lit chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the room. Everything in this place seemed meticulously chosen, as though each item had a purpose far beyond aesthetic. "Mr. Drymore?" Ethan called, voice bouncing off the walls and returning to him in soft echoes. There was no answer. Ethan took a few steps inside, feeling the cold settle into his bones. He checked his phone. No service. Of course. The last text he'd received from Elias was simple, even for a man of his wealth and status. "The key is under the mat. I'll be arriving shortly. Make yourself comfortable." He knelt and found the key where Elias had said it would be. A simple brass key with no label or identification, then unlocked the door. No one was there. But that's when he saw it, on a small table by the door, a handwritten note. It was addressed to him. "Welcome to my cabin, Ethan. I trust you've made yourself comfortable. Please observe the following instructions carefully. 1. Do not light the fireplace unless you are cold to the bone. 2. Do not leave the room while the fire burns. 3. Never fall asleep in front of the fire. 4. If you hear whispers, do not respond. I will be with you shortly." Ethan frowned at the note. It wasn't exactly the type of welcoming gesture he'd been expecting from a billionaire. The rules felt odd. He checked the time. It was 9:45 p.m. He could have sworn he'd been driving for much longer than that. The strange hour made his head swim, and suddenly the desire to put on some warmth, even from the fire, seemed far more pressing. Just relax. It's just a cabin. It's just a job. With a sigh, Ethan tossed the note aside and made his way to the fireplace. The rules seemed strange, but he was here to work, not to entertain fantasies. He knelt to inspect the logs, noting how dry they were. A match struck, and soon the crackling flames filled the room, casting long shadows across the walls. It wasn't until the fire was roaring that he felt the odd chill in the air begin to recede. But something wasn't quite right. He could have sworn the the flames were moving, not naturally, but with purpose. They twisted and stretched unnaturally. He shook his head, muttering to himself, "Get it together, Ethan. It's just the fire. You're here to work." But as he settled into an armchair near the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The faint sound of whispering drifted through the crackling flames, so soft at first that it could have been the wind, but it wasn't. The whispers were unmistakable, voices speaking in unison, though the words were indistinguishable. He stood abruptly, eyes darting toward the fire. The flames danced higher, as though they were reacting to him. The air thickened. "It's nothing," he told himself. "Just nerves. It's late. You've been driving for hours." But as the room grew colder and the fire flickered with a life of its own, Ethan's pulse quickened. And that's when the first whisper reached his ears with chilling clarity. "Come closer." Ethan stood motionless in front of the roaring fireplace, staring into the shifting flames as if they were alive. The heat washed over him, but it didn't feel comforting. It felt controlled. A presence beyond the crackling wood moved in the fire. He could feel it, hear it whispering, growing louder in his ears. He swallowed, rubbing his palms together nervously. The rules had been clear. Never leave the room while the fire burns. But why? Why did it matter? He stepped away from the chair and paced the room, the strange sensation of being watched gnawing at him. Each movement of the fire seemed to anticipate his steps, shifting like a living thing, curling up toward the ceiling, reaching out toward him. He had read enough of Drymore stories to know that the man was eccentric, but this felt more than eccentric. This felt wrong. Forcing himself to calm down, Ethan took a seat back in the armchair. He stared at the fire again, his mind racing through the possibilities. "It's just the isolation," he thought. "You've been on the road too long. It's nothing but the cold playing tricks on you." He tried to refocus on the task at hand. His job. He was here to write a book, Drymore's memoir. Nothing more. But the weight of the silence pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. The whispers were gone now, leaving only the sound of the fire's crackling and the occasional groan of the house settling in the night. But still, something lingered. He glanced around the cabin, taking in its opulence and strangeness all over again. The polished floors gleamed under the low light. Antique furniture lined the walls, covered in dark, rich fabrics. Portraits of people, most of whom he didn't recognize, stared back at him from every corner. Each painting seemed to exude a sense of sadness, of loss. But there was something even darker behind their eyes, a shared knowing that made Ethan shudder. Despite the cold, Ethan opened his notebook and scribbled down a few notes. He needed something to focus on, anything to distract him from the bizarre tension in the air. Elias Drymore, reclusive billionaire, known for strange behavior, wealth beyond measure, isolated for years. No family, no close friends, only a handful of staff. The more he wrote, the more he felt the weight of the strange rules imposed on him. They felt personal. As if the fire wasn't just a thing to keep him warm, but a thing that required his compliance, his attention. He glanced back at the flames again. "I'll just stay here for a bit longer," he told himself. "Until Elias arrives. This is probably all just some strange test or initiation into the world of the ultra-rich. Nothing to be afraid of. But even as the thought entered his mind, he knew it wasn't true. Something was wrong. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the fire seemed to intensify. The flames flickered, their shadows twisting and stretching in unnatural patterns. The room had grown uncomfortably warm, yet he felt a chill creeping into his bones, a cold that hadn't been there before. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, began to feel numb. His thoughts, once sharp and rational, felt muddied, like something was clouding his mind. Ethan stood up again, this time with more purpose. It's fine, he thought. Just walk around, keep your mind busy. Get some fresh air, maybe. But as he made his way toward the door, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, clearer, more insistent. Come closer. Ethan froze in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned slowly toward the fire, unable to take his eyes off the dancing flames. He could hear them, the voices, now distinct in their urgency. They weren't coming from anywhere in particular, not from the walls, not from the air, but from the fire itself. His stomach twisted in knots. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the walls bending inward as if they were closing in on him. He felt dizzy, disoriented. His throat went dry and his legs buckled beneath him as he stumbled backward, catching himself on the edge of the table. His eyes never left the fire. Come closer, come closer. Ethan's pulse quickened. The flames seemed to beckon him, almost physically pulling at him, like hands made of fire stretching out to him from the hearth. He could feel the warmth on his skin, but it wasn't comforting. It wasn't natural. The heat radiating from the fire felt wrong. Without thinking, without fully understanding what was happening, he took a step forward. The fire seemed to react immediately, the flames growing higher and brighter as if they were drawing strength from his movement. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Closer, closer. His mind screamed at him to stop, but he couldn't. He couldn't move. His body was no longer his own. He was drawn to the fire as though it were the only thing in the world that mattered. His limbs felt heavy, his thoughts clouded by the intensity of the heat and the beckoning voices. Ethan was so close now, his hand almost brushing against the burning logs, but something snapped within him. A single thought, a voice inside his head, broke through the haze. Get away. Get away now. With a cry, he staggered backward, stumbling away from the fire. The sudden movement broke the trance, and the world seemed to snap back into focus. The flames stopped their frantic dance, retreating slightly as though confused by his sudden resistance. Ethan fell to the floor, his heart racing in his chest, struggling to breathe as the warmth from the fire suddenly felt too much. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his body trembled. He couldn't understand what had just happened. Why had he almost given in to it? Why had he felt compelled to step closer to the fire? He shook his head, trying to steady himself. There was no rational explanation. None at all. He looked back at the fire, and the shadows seemed to twist around him, almost alive in their movement. The room had grown deathly silent, save for the sound of his rapid breathing and the crackling fire. It was as though the world had shifted around him. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The fire, though still burning brightly, seemed to settle back into a normal rhythm, its flames no longer dancing wildly, but burning steadily as they should. Ethan couldn't help but wonder if what had just happened was in his head. Was it exhaustion, stress, or something else? He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the dizziness from his thoughts. He had to get control of himself. As he sat there on the floor catching his breath, a terrible realization struck him. Elias hadn't arrived yet. He wasn't sure why, but for some reason, the fact that Elias had not shown up yet, after all this time, felt wrong. Ethan had expected him to arrive shortly after he'd settled in, but it had been hours. Elias was a wealthy, powerful man, not someone who would waste time on games. The idea that he might be avoiding him, that perhaps Elias had some sinister reason for keeping his distance, sent a wave of cold dread through Ethan's spine. His mind spun with questions. What was Drymore hiding? What was the fire really doing to him? And then the final, terrible thought hit him. Had he been chosen for something else entirely? Ethan's heart pounded as he stared at the fire, the flames now nothing more than a flickering reminder of the strange compulsion he had just experienced. He tried to steady his breath, but it was as if the very air in the room had become thick and suffocating. The cabin, once full of opulence and mystery, now felt suffocating, like a trap. He hadn't been prepared for this. Not for the whispers, not for the fire, not for whatever was lurking in the shadows. He thought he had been rational, logical, the kind of man who could face anything with a cool head. But this was beyond reason, beyond anything his journalistic mind could process. What the hell is happening? His eyes darted to the small table where the note still lay. He read the instructions again, as though reading them could somehow provide the answers he so desperately needed. Do not leave the room while the fire burns. Never fall asleep in front of the fire. If you hear whispers, do not respond. The first two rules had been broken already. The fire had been burning for hours, and he had stepped away from it. He had heard the whispers, and against every ounce of rational thought in his head, he had responded. His body had moved toward the fire, as if it had a mind of its own. Had he fallen into some trap? Was this some twisted psychological game Drymore was playing? The third rule seemed clear now. Never fall asleep in front of the fire. Ethan shuddered at the thought. Was the fire capable of pulling someone into its depths, trapping them in some endless slumber? Or was it more than that? Was it capable of something far worse? He stood up abruptly, his legs shaky as he moved across the room, pacing again. The walls seemed to close in around him, their dark corners beckoning with silent menace. His footsteps echoed loudly in the otherwise quiet room, every creak of the floorboards amplifying the sense of isolation. The only thing that kept him tethered to reality was the roaring fire, the one thing that still felt like it belonged to this world. He glanced at the door again, but the idea of stepping outside the room seemed more dangerous than ever. The note had said not to leave the room while the fire burned. If Elias had meant for him to stay here, trapped in this cabin, who was he to argue with that? But as he looked toward the window, the snow was beginning to fall heavily outside, the storm growing fiercer with every passing minute. He couldn't help but wonder if Drymore was deliberately keeping him here, away from the safety of the outside world. Why? He returned to the fire, but this time, his gaze was no longer full of curiosity. It was warier, more distrustful. Whatever this fire was, it wasn't a normal fire. The heat was too intense, too precise in its movement. The flames were not random. They seemed deliberate. They reached up, twisting as though searching for something. His blood ran cold as a thought crept into his mind. The fire was alive. His hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The oppressive air of the cabin made it hard to think straight. The rules, the fire, the whispers. Elias was nowhere to be found. It wasn't just the cabin that was off, it was everything about this experience. Nothing made sense anymore. Nothing felt normal. Then, like a jolt of electricity, the truth hit him like a hammer to the chest. This is a test. The realization was instant, an undeniable certainty that spread through him like wildfire. Drymore wasn't just some eccentric billionaire, he was something more, something dangerous. And the cabin? The fire? It was all part of the test. A twisted game designed to push him to the brink of madness. And the rules weren't just rules, they were laws. Laws that couldn't be ignored. Ethan staggered back, suddenly feeling small in the grand haunted room. He'd been a fool to think he could simply walk into this man's world and play by his own rules. Drymore had known what he was doing. This wasn't about a book. It wasn't about writing a memoir. This was a test of endurance, of obedience, a test of survival. And it was a test that Ethan wasn't sure he was going to pass. As the minutes ticked by, the fire continued to crackle, its dance growing more frenzied. Ethan's eyes darted to the clock on the wall, the one he hadn't noticed earlier. It had stopped ticking, completely frozen at 2:33 a.m. No, not now, not this. Suddenly the room seemed darker, as though the walls were breathing in time with his frantic pulse. His thoughts scattered. He needed to leave, to break free, to run out of this nightmare. But when his eyes returned to the fire, the flames shifted again. This time they reached out for him. The flames curled upward, then stretched toward the open space in front of them, drawing him in once more. He felt the pull. Not a physical force, but something deeper, something far more powerful. The fire wasn't just burning, it was waiting. Ethan's breath hitched in his chest as the air in the room thickened, pushing against him, pulling him toward the flames like a magnet. But this time, he resisted. His body trembled, but he held his ground. He glanced once more at the door, at the window. Then, with shaky steps, he backed away from the fire and made his way to the farthest corner of the room. The walls closed in as though the house was trying to swallow him whole. Suddenly, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. He spun around, his heart stopping in his chest. The front door, which had been tightly shut since he arrived, was now open, wide enough for a person to step through. He stood frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. But then he heard it again. The sound of footsteps, faint but distinct, walking slowly toward him. They were heavy, methodical, as though the person walking had all the time in the world. Ethan's pulse quickened, his breath catching in his throat as the door creaked shut once more. A figure appeared in the doorway, Elias Drymore. He was dressed in dark, tailored clothes, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. His expression was unreadable, cold, almost predatory. He stepped into the room, and the air shifted again. It was as if his presence commanded the space, made the room feel smaller, tighter. "Good evening, Ethan," Elias said, his voice smooth and dark. There was no warmth in it, no friendliness, just a calm, almost casual acknowledgement. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. His throat was dry, his body frozen with fear. "You've done well to make it this far," Elias continued, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Most people fail almost immediately. The rules are there for a reason. They're not suggestions, Ethan. They're necessary." Ethan could feel the weight of the word, necessary. He knew then that Drymore wasn't just watching him, he was measuring him, evaluating him. What do you want from me?" Ethan finally managed to ask, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the fire, his hand outstretched. Ethan could almost see the shadows bending around him, as though they were reacting to his movement. The flames shifted, as if acknowledging their master. Elias spoke again, his voice soft, but his words carrying the weight of inevitability. "The test is almost over." Ethan felt the air go cold. He looked back at the fire, his stomach turning. The flames, though still burning, no longer seemed like fire. They seemed like something else, something older, something darker. And in that moment, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Drymore had won. The fire, the rules, the whispers, they had been preparing him for this moment all along. This wasn't just a test of survival, it was a test of will. And as the shadows closed in around him, Ethan realized there was no escaping it. He had been marked from the beginning. As Elias stepped forward, his hand brushing against the flames, Ethan felt the last of his resistance slip away. The fire waited. If you enjoyed this chilling story and want to hear more, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video from us. Share this with someone who loves a good horror story, and let us know what you think in the comments below. And remember, if you're ready for more spine-tingling tales, this is the place to be. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay safe and keep the fire burning.